Welcome to KR Films Entertainment Channel. The ancient Greeks, oddly enough, softly speaking, were not so much tolerant towards slaves. Even the most famous Greek writers and philosophers called slaves nothing less than a living object, and only free men and women were honored in Greece, while others were foreigners and strangers or xenos who had neither a citizenship nor status. Since then, by the way, the word xenophobia, i.e., prejudice against strangers or a fear of strangers, has appeared with all this. Male slaves and female slaves were nearly the backbone of the economy of ancient Greece. So, any treatises of the time mention slaves directly or indirectly, almost incessantly. Foreign women and enslaved girls typically appeared in the markets in only 3 weeks. The first standard was captured slave girls in wars and attacks on neighbors. The second, which was not so common but still existed, was the sale of children into slavery by their parents. For one instance, a father could sell his own daughter into slavery for certain sins. For example, for excessive debauchery. In the third was the abandoned children who were found on the streets and pots, were simply wrapped in rags. Such a baby was by default no longer considered a free person, and the finder had the full right to say that the child was his own slave. From then on, the new master could do whatever he wanted with the finding. The wretched began their journey of pain in the slave market, where young girls and women stood on the platform or elevated platform, so that the buyer could assess the merits and flaws before buying. After purchasing a slave, her fate depended on where she was taken. If in the home, either the mistress, the lawful spouse, or the key holder determined what kind of work the newcomer would be assigned. To the slave was sent either to the kitchen or to be employed as a laundry attendant, or to weave fabric and sew clothes. In the household, slaves were assigned to weaving garlands, cleaning bronze dishes, and if it turned out that a slave had good taste, she could be assigned to serve the landlady, dress her, and even do her hair. If the owner was satisfied, she could offer her a treat, but if not, she could slap or beat her. If the young woman was bought to satisfy the master's whims and wishes, it was one story, but in case if she was bought to help the mistress of the house, it was an entirely different story. In both cases, however, it should be emphasized, the slave in the master's house was between two flames. The issue was that the official and legitimate wife always feared that the new slave might attract the lord by her appearance, her efficiency, or her diligence. And the key lady, usually an old slave, feared that the younger slave would replace her and the old one would simply be kicked out into the street. And in this aspect, the aspirations of the landlady and the main housekeeper were the same. So the intrigues begin. By any methods, the official female half of the family tried to squeeze such a slave woman out of the house and get rid of the competition. There were all kinds of techniques, including implicitly influencing the husband to self or give us a gift the slave girl. Sometimes intrigues were twisted so that the slave was blamed for some misdeed or unpleasant event in the house, for which she could simply be murdered, and the owner was not responsible for the death. He bought the item broke, and what to do with it is the owner's sole right, and others should not intrude with their advice into the private life and home of others. With all the seeming barbarity of such a postulate for the ancient Greeks, such a worldview was considered to be benign in its core. As stated above, slaves were something like a cheap watches for their masters. They could be thrown away, they broke. Surely this only applied to well-to-do and rich families. In low-income families, it was almost impossible to kill a slave, just on a whim, who would do the housework and simultaneously please the master, while the new slave cost a lot of money. Speaking of more intimate pleasures, women were often bought into homes for the simple purpose of providing special services to their master or lord. There was even such a concept as the purchase of a slave for care or education. These slaves were called palakis, concubines. They were bought by older and younger Greeks. The formers of the slave could provide sufficient care for the old men. The latter, to gain experience in intimacy, palakis had to perform a lot of duties, cleaning the master's clothes, filling the bathroom, serving at the table during family dinners, as well as during the reception of visitors. And needless to say, to satisfy the master's needs for feminine fondness, if the master was visited by guests, the slave was obliged at the master's command to please any of those who wished to feel love. Any children born to a slave were viewed as the master's property, and had no right to the status of a free citizen. Again, the child, by the master's single decision, might not be left alive but simply drowned. It was a rather wild practice for a master to sell his palakis to a guest or another man purely for special services. It was not an ownership sale but a one-time action, so one might say the Greek laws even set a maximum rate that could be charged. For an example, the so-called flute girls or flutist slaves, who could play the flute and entertain guests with music among other things, did not have to cost more than 2 drachmas for special privileges. True, there were obviously some exceptions. History has preserved the case when the owner arranged a sort of bidding among the guests. A young and beautiful flute slave girl was put up for an open auction right during the feast. The highest bidder went with the beauty to a separate room to receive a comfort exactly during the feast. Curiously, even the world-famous Socrates participated in such a feast at least once in his lifetime. The memories of this have come down to our time thanks to the historian Xenophon, who described the great feast of the Greek nobleman Callias. When the tables were cleaned and the guests had made their offerings and sung a song of praise, it was time for entertainment. A flutist and an acrobat and a handsome boy who played the lyre and danced were brought out. Socrates said, "In the name of Zeus Callias, you have amused us splendidly." It is not stated exactly how else the host entertained the guests, but as already mentioned, the flute is not only delighted the ears of the guests with wonderful music. Another function of slaves was to provide special services, but in brothels where girls could enter either directly from the slave market or after being sold by their master. As a common occurrence, young women were recruited and taught the basics of the profession. Services were provided either in the building itself or outside in secluded corners. Here again, the cost of such services was strictly regulated by laws. For example, a street service cost about 1/6 of a drachma, but depending on the status of the establishment itself, naturally all the money earned was given to the householder because the slave had no right to any personal property, especially money. The intriguing thing is that theoretically a slave could gain her freedom, though only theoretically, but in the history of ancient Greece there is a notorious case of Neaira, a slave who managed to achieve the status of the official spouse of a free Greek citizen. Giving birth to his children by going the hard and long path, Neaira was able to achieve the unbelievable for a slave woman. But the free citizens, outraged that the children of a slave would in essence become free citizens during the process, words were spoken that very clearly described the attitude towards such a matter. For them, they will have complete freedom to live in marriage with whomever they please and to declare whomever they desire to be the father of their children, and your laws will be ineffective and void, and such women will have the power to get whatever they want. It is precisely because of this process that we can today have a little idea of how slaves lived, and how they were treated. In the beginning, Neaira was bought for 3 drachmas by 2 young men, who lived with her alternately. The girl was also obliged to fulfill the whims of all of the guests who visited this incomprehensible semi-homestead. Thus one of those young men, Lysias, explained it this way: the woman was mutual property. Each of us paid the money for her evenly. A little later she was ransomed by another Greek Phrygian at one of the feasts. A really wild and unimaginable thing happened. When the master of the house was drunk out of his mind with his slave girl, Neaira was firstly with all of the guests who come to the feast, and then with all the enslaved men. What is most incredible was that during the feast, this was the slaves could also have belonged to religious temples. In that case, they were called hierodols. The task of the hierodols was to thank the temple visitors for the offerings and sacrifices they brought, of course, thank them in a specific fashion. When a female slave became too old and infirm, she was simply thrown out into the street without any regret, and she lived off the occasional charity. Thanks for watching.